All right. Good afternoon, everyone who's joining us from probably around the world. I am the chair of the Holocaust Memorial Lecture Committee at Washington University in St. Louis. My name is Annika Walke, so I'd like to welcome you to this event tonight, which brings us really across the ocean in more ways than one, I think. I'm a member of the history department here, but I'm also affiliated with a number of other departments, primarily because of my work really straddles many different regions. But I also work on the Holocaust, and I think that kind of predestined me to this role as the chair of the Holocaust Memorial Lecture Committee. And I'm really excited to be a member of this group because I think we've had really interesting events in the past. But before I say a few words about the lecture, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional ancestral lands of the Osage Nation, Missouri, and the Illini Confederacy, who were removed unjustly. We in this community are the beneficiaries of that removal. We pay respect to elders both past and present as we live, work, and study here at Washington University in St. Louis. The Holocaust Memorial Lecture is an annual event currently supported by the Center for Humanities at our university. It was inaugurated in 1989 by then Chancellor William H. Danforth, who at the request of both students and faculty appointed a committee to establish a permanent lecture to commemorate the Holocaust and also to educate the public about the broader implications of other instances of systematic persecution, mass murder, and genocide. Typically, the lecture is held on or near November 9th, which was yesterday, meaning the anniversary of the Night of Pogroms in 1938, during which members of the SA and a mob of civilians destroyed hundreds of synagogues, plundered and ransacked Jewish homes, hospitals, and schools in Nazi Germany. In that night, more than 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and imprisoned in concentration camp. This night was a turning point. The night marked a shift from the economic, social, and political persecution and marginalization of German Jews to the use of physical violence, of incarceration, and of murder against them. The Night of Pogroms also marked a turning point in relations between Nazi Germany and the rest of the world. The brutality of the pogrom and the Nazi government's deliberate policy of encouraging the violence once it had begun laid bare the widespread anti-Semitism in German society that could be mobilized for murder. Newspapers around the world reported on and condemned the pogrom. The United States recalled their ambassador. Other governments protested with diplomatic notes. The British government approved the Kindertransport, a campaign to evacuate Jewish children from Germany after the international community had failed to develop a plan to support Jewish refugees who tried to escape Germany earlier in the year. World opinion thus turned sharply against the Nazi regime, with some politicians calling for war. That war did not happen. There was no intervention. 1938 was in many ways a year of escalation and of the failure of the international community to stop a process that eventually would lead to genocide. The Night of Pogrom symbolizes the radicalization of the Nazi regime and of German society as much as the inability to stop them. One might say that commemorating November 9th, 1938, we mark a point of no return, of a moment that indicated the increasing radicalization of Nazi violence, which just a few months later turned to open warfare. With the attack on Poland on the 1st of September 1938, Nazi Germany set out to implement the plan to reorder Europe, a plan that rested on the twinned process of exploitation and extermination, of conquering territory in Eastern Europe to exploit the land and its people, and to physically destroy peoples that were deemed racially inimical or inferior. Just weeks later, on the 8th of October 1939, the first ghetto for Jewish residents was established in Piotrków Trybunalski, which signaled a new stage in the treatment of Jews who were under Nazi rule. Their physical, spatial segregation from others, and their internment under deplorable conditions that were designed to impoverish, hurt, and likely kill the residents indicated that after expulsion and forced displacement, Nazi violence against Jews had reached a new stage. Now we know that this violence only intensified and eventually would be followed by mass murder in the killing fields and extermination camps of Eastern Europe. The ghettos were an essential part of the extermination process and have received increased attention in recent years. Natalia Aleksiun, a dear colleague and friend who is our speaker for tonight, has made important contributions to the study of Jewish life under and against Nazi persecution in the ghettos and elsewhere in German-occupied Eastern Europe. I'm thrilled to welcome her tonight, and I look forward to her presentation, which I think will be of interest to many members of our university, which includes a very large medical school where students, graduate and professional students, and of course faculty members grapple with difficult ethical questions. Before I hand over to Flora Casson to introduce our speaker for tonight, I want to thank the staff of the Center for Humanities for their support, especially Kathleen Fields, who has done a wonderful job advertising the lecture in all sorts of media. Sorry. The downside of being on a campus. I'm also very grateful to Simone Bequet, Arts and Sciences Marketing and Communications Manager, who has set up the webinar and is on standby should we run into any technological trouble. And last but not least, I want to thank the members of the Holocaust Memorial Lecture Committee who have helped plan this event and make the difficult decision about this year's event that we had very much hoped to organize in its regular format, but because of the ongoing pandemic decided to remain virtual. But we very much hope to see you all next year in person. I will now hand over the microphone, so to speak, to Flora Casson, Professor and Chair of Jewish and Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies here at Washington University, who will introduce our speaker for tonight.
Thank you, Annika. Good night, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the 2021 Holocaust Memorial Lecture by Professor Aleksiun. We know that everyone has busy schedules, and we are grateful that you are here with us. Dr. Aleksiun is currently Professor of Modern Jewish History at Touro College's Graduate School of Jewish Studies in New York, but she has recently accepted a new prestigious position, and so will soon be the Harry Rich Professor of Holocaust Studies at the University of Florida. Congratulations on your new position, Professor Aleksiun. Natalia Aleksiun is a specialist in the social, political, and cultural history of modern East European and Polish Jewry. She has written extensively on the history of the Jewish intelligentsia in East Central Europe, on Polish-Jewish relations, on modern Jewish historiography, and on the history of medicine and the Holocaust. She holds doctoral degrees from Warsaw University in Poland and from NYU, New York University in New York. I actually met Professor Aleksiun in the year 2000 when I started my own doctoral studies at NYU. We were in the same program, but she already had a doctorate from Warsaw University in Poland. And when I asked her why, she told me that there was just so much more to learn about her topic. And anyone who's done a PhD and knows how long and difficult it is will know that Professor Aleksiun's decision to get a second one is really the mark of a dedicated scholar, of someone with an uncommon passion for her subject and a deep commitment to keep deepening her knowledge and understanding of a very difficult period in human history. Her extensive publication record since leaving NYU demonstrates that passion and dedication. She has published widely in English, Polish, and in Hebrew. She's the author of Where To, the Zionist Movement in Poland from 1944 to 1950, published in Warsaw in 2002. She also prepared a new edition of Gerson Tafet's Destruction of Zolkiew's Jews, which was published in 2019. Dr. Aleksiun is also the co-editor of several volumes, including Pauline, Studies in Jewish History, Volume 29 on Writing Jewish History in Eastern Europe, and of European Holocaust Studies, Volume 3 on Places, Spaces, and Voids in the Holocaust. During this academic year, she's a senior research fellow at the Polish Institute of Advanced Studies in Warsaw, where she's completing not one, but two books, Hidden Lives, The Social History of Hiding in Eastern Galicia, and The Anatomy of Antisemitism, Jews and Cadavers in East Central Europe Before the Holocaust. Her most recent book, Conscious History, was published just a few months ago. It highlights the historical scholarship of Polish Jews during the interwar period. As Jews struggled to assert their place in a newly independent Poland, a dedicated group of Jewish scholars, fascinated by history, devoted themselves to creating a sense of Polish Jewish belonging, while also fighting for their rights as an ethnic minority. They sought to forge a community aware of its past, its cultural heritage, and its achievements. Though no less important were their efforts to counter the increased hostility towards Jews in the public discourse of the day. In highlighting the role of public intellectuals and the social role of scholars and historical scholarship, Dr. Aleksiun's study adds a new dimension to the understanding of the Polish Jewish world in the interwar period. In her talk tonight, she will discuss the work and struggle of Polish Jewish physicians, another group of Jewish professionals who had to struggle in a tragic and almost impossible situation. Professor Aleksiun will discuss how pre-existing professional relationships, a sense of gratitude for medical services rendered in the past, and an ongoing need for Jewish physicians' expertise laid the foundation for a network of support that allowed Jewish physicians to continue to work in the face of the Holocaust, and in the case of some, to survive. There will be a question and answer session at the end of Professor Aleksiun's talk. So please put your questions in the Q&A. You can put them in the Q&A at any time during the talk, and we'll collect them and ask the questions at the end. So this is my introduction. Professor Aleksiun, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Kassen and Professor Walke, for this introduction. Truly generous one, and I was terrified because I don't remember what I answered to your question. So thank you for remembering my answer from many years ago, and thank you for having me tonight. I say tonight because it's midnight in Warsaw, where I am right now, and I'm thrilled to be here and to share with you this part of my research, and I'm very much looking forward to a conversation tonight and maybe in the future. So let me now give you some insight into these stories. Oops. Over the last 9 months of the German occupation, Dr. Ludwig Landau hid in a village outside of Zbarasz, a picture of which you can see here, in eastern Galicia, today in western Ukraine. In Landau's account, it becomes clear that his survival was closely tied to his being a physician. A graduate of the prestigious medical school at the University of Vienna, he served as a city physician in Zbarasz before the outbreak of World War II. In the first months of the German occupation, Landau relied on help from his patients, including a local Ukrainian priest. He survived the first wave of roundups wearing a white coat and the armband of a physician. He secured his Aryan papers for his daughters, and here another picture of Zbarasz from before World War I. Papers for his daughters, one of whom was a future Israeli writer, Ida Fink, through his Polish colleagues, and he was hidden by a poor widow. Apart from his personal circumstances, Landau's account gives us insight into Jewish physicians' entanglements and survival strategies during the Holocaust. In the ghettos and in Nazi-occupied Poland, communities struggled to provide medical assistance to the Jews. Public health in the largest ghettos has been studied by scholars, most recently in a very important book by Miriam Offer, and survivor testimonies give us insight into parallel efforts in smaller towns, as well as into the lives of medical professionals. Today, I want to focus on the wartime relationships among physicians and between physicians and their patients. I rely on Jewish testimonies, diaries, and memoirs penned by physicians, their family members, and patients. These documents suggest that Jewish physicians who escaped roundups often attempted to find shelter in the vicinity of their hometowns, such as Zbarash, or places where they had practiced medicine before the war and under the Soviet occupation. Often we lack information about the circumstances of some of these efforts, such as in the case of this poor widow, Agnieszka Mazurkiewicz, who hid Landau in the last 9 months of the war. And we don't know the exact motivation of those who offered them shelter. Was it connected to the medical profession of the survivor, especially when the physicians were eventually murdered? Yet personal accounts suggest that many of the attempts relied on pre-existing professional relationships. Now, I focus on Nazi-occupied Eastern Galicia, and you can see here a map from end of World War I, when this area became part of the Second Polish Republic, but obviously under the German occupation, this is a slightly different shape. I focus on Eastern Galicia to explore how the Jewish doctors' relationships with non-Jewish patients and fellow physicians came to play a critical role, providing opportunities to find rescue, either in hiding or in passing as non-Jews. The networks of former patients and Jewish and non-Jewish physicians and medical professionals loom large in the personal accounts from the region, which had been part of the Habsburg Austria, as you can see here, Austrian Empire before World War I, and had become part of the Second Polish Republic in its aftermath. It was occupied by the Soviets in the fall of 1939 and came under German occupation in the summer of 1941. The Red Army liberated Eastern Galicia 3 years later. Personal accounts from Eastern Galicia bring the unique place that Jewish physicians occupied in a social landscape of the region and its role in their survival into sharp relief. And this is something that I want to relate to in a moment. Social interactions between Jewish physicians and non-Jewish patients harken back to the relationship that developed before the war. In the Second Polish Republic, Jewish men and women played a prominent role in the medical profession and built an impressive network of health institutions, a subject for a separate lecture. According to 1931 data, Jews comprised some 46% of the total number of physicians in Poland. This is when the general percentage of Jews in Poland is under 10%. Their part in the profession was particularly prominent in the country's largest cities, Warsaw, Łódź, Lwów, and others. However, in the region of Galicia, and in particular in its eastern part, Jewish physicians were even more prominent. They made up 70.9% of all physicians. And what you see here are just two towns, Zbarasz and Borysław, from a address book in 1929, and the local physicians are listed by name. Now, if you know the conditions, you will see the names that dominate are all Jewish names, and in some other towns, these would be only Jewish names. What this meant on the ground is that in smaller towns and in rural areas where Jewish physicians were the only ones treating patients, but even if they competed with ethnic Poles and Ukrainians, this is the area with Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews being the main ethnic religious national groups, they built a web of relationships. Encountering many of their patients in times of physical and emotional pain, angst over the medical prognosis, and worry about the cost of the treatment, especially in poorer areas, some Jewish physicians built lasting bonds that had a bearing on these relationships during the war. In the early weeks of the German occupation, in the summer of 1941, physicians fell victim to the policies of extermination together with other members of Jewish intelligentsia in many, many Eastern Galician towns. Stanisławów, today Ivano-Frankivsk in Ukraine, Żółkiew, Żołkwa, today Zbarasz, among many others. Physicians who survived the initial pogroms and mass shootings played a prominent role in mobilizing communal efforts to care for the sick in Jewish hospitals and outpatient clinics. In Sokal, today also in Western Ukraine, Dr. David Kindler, whom you can see here with his family members after the war, treated poor Jews without asking for payment. In Tarnopol, the community supported an orphanage, an old age home, a public kitchen, an outpatient clinic, and a Jewish hospital. Jewish physicians took good care of the Jewish population, recalled a Jewish female survivor from this town. Baruch Milch, who practiced medicine in Tłuste, today Tovste in Western Ukraine, under the Soviet occupation, had a private practice. Here is World War I period picture of Tłuste and Sokal before. He became the doctor under the German occupation. He became the doctor at the Judenrat clinic and opened a small clinic for Jews in a private home in a ghetto, and treated particularly severe cases of infectious diseases such as typhus and dysentery, which were very common, and we know about terrible hygienic situations in ghettos in general. In Zbarasz, with which we started tonight, where at the beginning of World War II, the Jewish population doubled with the arrival of refugees from Western Poland, and this is the case throughout Eastern Galicia, the community organized an outpatient clinic, which was headed by Ludwig Landau. Dr. Marek Eisner began practicing medicine. Here is Baruch Milch, whom I quoted, and here is Marek Eisner, began practicing medicine in his hometown of Borszczów, today Borszczyw in Ukraine, after he graduated from the University of Vienna as well in 1932. He continued working as a physician under the Soviet and then the German occupation. As the sanitary conditions among the Jews and their access to food worsened, Eisner fought the typhus epidemic and visited the homes of infected Jews and non-Jews. He also treated members of the German administration, their entourage, their family members. And these must have been fairly intimate visits. He describes for example, visits to the home of a wife of a local German official by the name of Viv, and he was treating her young child. Eisner's fluency in German, hardly unusual among the Jewish intelligentsia in the region, may have helped to put his German patients at ease. As in Borszczów, as well as in other Galician towns, German functionaries and their local collaborators found themselves forced to rely on Jewish physicians. Milch noted that there were no Christian doctors in Tłuste. All 5, he writes, were Jews: Dr. Meltzer, Greenberg, Aberman, my brother-in-law, and I. Since the new mayor's family were my patients, he writes, the Ukrainian authorities named me the municipal doctor. Just a note on the side, this is completely against the rules, as it were, of occupation. Milch also noted the appointment and the fact that I wore a red, not a blue Star of David on my sleeve gave me a certain amount of immunity from harassment and relative freedom of movement. My work brought me into contact with key Ukrainian and German killers these are local killers, of course. The dearth of non-Jewish physicians in Eastern Galicia made the services of Jewish physicians, non-Jewish physicians, made the services of Jewish physicians by local German civilian and military administration a pragmatic necessity that temporarily overrode racist taboos, rhetoric, and regulations. Eisner recalled his position of a relative privilege in Borszczów, and I quote, "Between roundups, I led a relatively peaceful life. German and Ukrainian authorities did not react much at the sight of an Aryan seeking medical assistance from a Jew from the city or the countryside due to the lack of Aryan physicians, except for one district physician who was more useful for administrative than medical purposes. It led to the fact that I got good provisions, which I generously shared with the inhabitants of the house, as well as the public kitchen for the poor Jews. This relative privilege of having access to additional resources brought from the Aryan side or from the quote unquote Aryan patients, since in these small towns, ghettos were created late or they remained open for a long time, relatively long time. But these contacts offered some relief to physicians' families. Here, Borszczów again, this is early image. In trying to care for his wife, Pepa, and his son, Lunek, whom you see here, Milch also relied on his non-Jewish patients. Some Jewish physicians were able to relocate temporarily to villages where they had better access to food and were not exposed or not as exposed daily to the German violence. Leon and Mina Deutsch, the graduates of the German medical school in Prague, who returned to Poland in 1938, moved to Mina's hometown, Mielnica Podilska in Ukraine today, continued to face dire difficulties with the shortage of fuel, food, and housing, and they had a very young child at this point. Despairing, they decided to seek permission to work in a large village where typhoid fever reigned, but where one was safer from the Gestapo. So in the spring of 1942, Leon Deutsch managed to bribe the public health officer to give him such permission to work in a large village called Dźwiniaczka and travel between smaller villages. As the only doctors in the village, the Deutsches had patients coming to them, as Mina writes in her memoir, almost immediately, and engaged in inoculating inhabitants of the villages against typhoid fever, making further more contacts in the area. Their situation improved. Mina writes, "We worked hard traveling between the villages, but felt relatively at peace. Patients paid for our visits with a loaf of bread, some flour, or potatoes. We were never hungry now. About once a week, we went to Mielnica to bring food to my parents and sisters." In other villages, the peasants benefited from this arrangement as well, and they had what she calls free medical care. Eisner's medical expertise provided him with some protection, or at least he was promised such protection, although he could not rely on it during roundups, or he couldn't be sure really. Among his patients were the German gendarmes who needed his help with venereal diseases. He also had to perform abortions when their lovers became pregnant. In exchange, the gendarmes explicitly promised to him not to harm him unless they had to. The Deutsches were also promised protection by a Ukrainian police chief in the village of Dviniachka. This well-disposed attitude was very fragile and difficult to navigate as it resulted from several elements. Leon's treating this policeman's wife as a physician, the Deutsches' transfer of their property to this family, and this man's interest in Mina. In the early months of 1942, with the onset of the deportations to the Bełżec killing center as part of Aleksiun Reinhardt, Jewish physicians and their families faced immediate mortal threat. The special armband was no longer sufficient, and many physicians were murdered or deported and murdered. However, they were among the few professionals considered useful enough that they had a chance of temporary release. So a native of Brody, Dr. Elkan Harmelin, settled in Bolesław, a very interesting industrial town in Eastern Galicia. Again, you can just see some images of it. And he practiced medicine there throughout the interwar period. In the action of October-November 1942, he was taken but separated from other Jews who were deported to Bełżec at the train station in the last moment. As his son recalled, for some reason, out of those 1,500 people that they took to the station, they released all the Jewish doctors. So my father was still alive. He was still intact. In some towns, as in Zbarasz, physicians were assigned to participate in selections, and therefore they were additionally considered useful and temporarily spared. As the ghettos were being liquidated, Jewish physicians found themselves barred from caring for non-Jewish Christian patients, even in town where there were no other physicians. This was the case in Tłuste with Milch, who describes how at some point in May 1943, the local pharmacist received an order no longer to fill his prescriptions for Christian patients, and that he was no longer allowed to move around. His pass that allowed him to be mobile was taken away. So this arrangement of temporary protection was coming to an end. From the beginning of the German occupation, some former patients provided Jewish physicians with vital information and sought to protect them. Such was the case of Dr. Juliusz Landau. This is not the same as the Landau with whom I started this discussion, in Bolesław. Having received his medical diploma in 1933, Landau was practicing in Złociw today, but during the Soviet occupation, he joined the clinic in Schodnica, suburb of Bolesław. During the pogrom in the summer of 1941, so at the very beginning of the German occupation, his former patient, Ivan Baran, saved his life by offering him a place to hide. Afterwards, Landau returned to work in the clinic and in a hospital where he attended to both Jewish and non-Jewish patients. During roundups, non-Jewish patients proved crucial for providing information about impending danger. In the summer of 1942, the Deutsches, who were still living in the village of Dviniachka, learned about the roundup that was taking place in Mielnica from a Polish peddler and their patient. Mina noted in her memoir, "We immediately took off by foot to another village where we stayed for a short time with some patients we had befriended." So Information came from a patient and they were sheltered by their patients. In the spring of 1943, they were again warned by a local Ukrainian police chief, the guy I mentioned earlier, the husband of one of Deutsch's patients, that a large-scale roundup would be imminent. Non-Jewish patients sheltered Jewish physicians and their family members. The action in Borisław that began in August 1942 was a turning point for the community because it was very, very large. But Raoul Harmelin's parents hid in the radiology room at the polyclinic, and one of his father's patients used his key to lock them in safely. In a subsequent roundup in October, November 42, another of Harmelin's patients hid Raoul, his son, his only son. Then during the roundup in December 1942, which lasted for 5 weeks, Harmelin's arranged a safe place for his wife with yet another patient who hid her without requesting payment. During one murderer's roundup in Borschtów, most likely in April 1943, Eisner was in a clinic outside of the ghetto, helping the chief physician, a non-Jew. Warned by one of his patients about a brutal hunt for the Jews in the city, Eisner managed to hide. He recalled how, at my request, the porter ordered a break in admitting the sick, asked those waiting to leave, and closed the waiting room. From a small chamber that led to the attic, I managed to get upstairs and drew the ladder with me, closing the entrance with an appropriate cover. The porter brought him food and let him know when the roundup was over. So it really all played out among people who knew him as a physician. Some physicians reflected on their sense of relative privilege. In 1943, Milch wrote, "During our escapes, we were treated rather well because I was known in the vicinity as a doctor. We were not waylaid in the fields, and occasionally a peasant let me spend the night in his house. Everyone envied me. Different was the fate of the hundreds and thousands of Jews who were not so lucky." However, in the spring of 1943, Milch counted on his former patients and was desperate to find shelter. And he writes, "None of my thousands of Christian patients came to offer help, except for Mrs. P, in whose house I am now being sheltered. She provided the service despite her limited means and her husband's reluctance. All the rest, our ostensible friends, contented themselves by expressing sorrow or offering us food. Repeatedly, Milch relied on his patients in finding shelter, but these offers were also limited. Nobody, for example, was willing to hide his toddler son. Small child was considered too dangerous. The massive wave of roundups in Eastern Galicia resulted in more attempts to flee from the ghettos. The odds of finding refuge among the local population were very limited, but it seemed that physicians had a relatively large network, a large pool of acquaintances among their patients. During the roundups in Borschtów, Eisner was offered hiding places by Poles and Ukrainians, peasants, and members of the local intelligentsia. Among those who offered shelter, he mentioned certain Mrs. Paszkowska, a wife of a local Ukrainian, active Ukrainian. This is important. He therefore suggests that this was an unusual gesture. After the ghetto in Borschtów was liquidated in July 1943, Eisner bunkered himself, as he writes, together with his sister at another patient of his, where he survived under difficult circumstances underground until the liberation in April 1944. Some medical professionals continued their work in hiding. On the run from the village of Dviniówka, the Deutsches found shelter with a peasant whose son suffered from tuberculosis of the bones. Deutsch had been treating, Leon Deutsch, the husband, had been treating the boy for some time with calcium injections, which seemed to be the only solution at the time. We knew that Kukurudza, this man's name, would try to keep us close by, so that Leon, the husband, could continue to treat his son, saving them from traveling an entire day by horse and buggy to see a doctor in town. He would also have to pay for those visits properly, not just with a loaf of bread or a few eggs as he did with my husband. So he really hides this Jewish couple, two doctors and their young daughter, and they continue to take care of his sick child, providing this medical assistance as a kind of quid pro quo. Throughout their ordeal, the Deutsch continued to administer injection to the son as needed. In January 1942 in Sokal, Kindler began asking Shmelke Maltz, a local Jewish merchant whose family he treated before the war, for advice in finding shelter for himself and his family, which led to him and his family joining the Maltzes, being hidden by a Polish-Ukrainian woman. This medical expertise was something that that Maltzes took into consideration in inviting him to join them. And indeed, he tried to treat one of the family members who was sick and died while in hiding. Professional networks among physicians and medical personnel were complex. Although they had certainly known one another before the war, especially in the smaller towns, they had also competed for patients. It seems that for quite a number of non-Jewish physicians, or at least these are the people that really get written about with great deal of pain and anger, the persecution of their Jewish colleagues opened new opportunities for advancement, as they eagerly embraced. In those accounts, they were presented often also as ideologically motivated, but they also were happy to take over well-equipped, modern private practices left behind. So Baruch Milch is one of those memoirists who describe a particular case in which Jewish doctor and his family are doomed because a local non-Jewish physician is interested in a house and the practice. However, other Jewish accounts point to explicit or implicit professional networks that physicians mobilized during the Holocaust. Kindler relied on two nurses whom he had befriended in his professional capacity and to whom he entrusted some of his money and other assets. These were crucial during the time of hiding. One living in a convent in Lviv, who used to work in a hospital in Sokal, and another who still worked there. He contacted the nurse still working in the hospital who had kept part of his money. She handed over the requested funds needed for warm blankets for him and his family in hiding, along with some underwear for the Kindlers, with which she also included a note saying that the bad times would soon be over and that the Kindler family is always in her prayers. Moreover, he sent a prescription for a medication needed in his place of hiding without signing it, and it is likely that the pharmacist recognized his handwriting, or at least guessed that the unsigned prescription comes from a Jewish doctor, but nevertheless decided to fill it. In the spring of 1944, Mina and Leon Deutsch, together with their daughter, emerged from their hiding place. And she writes, "All the survivors, including ourselves, were in terrible condition, emaciated and barely able to walk. Though we were not living in constant fear as before, we still were uneasy and didn't know what to expect. However, owing to their medical skills, again, their situation began to improve. Gradually, she writes, after a few weeks, word spread that there were doctors back in town, and people began to call on us for medical attention. Despite the scarcity of food, which affected even the farmers, we were given a little something for visits, which helped a great deal. For one of his consultations, and this is an interesting story in and of itself, Deutsch received a box of sulfur, which apparently was used to treat gonorrhea, and for which a Russian military officer paid 1,000 rubles, which again was used for basically helping other survivors and the Deutsches. On the Soviet recommendation, Leon Deutsch, the only surviving male physician in the area, set up a general hospital in Mielnica. They were also seeing patients at home. After liberation, the surviving Jewish physicians were in great demand. Baruch Milch and his brother-in-law returned to work in Tłuste. In Borszczów, Eisner returned to the local hospital until he was repatriated to Poland, first to Bytom and then to Szczecin, to the so-called recovered territories. Survivors worked in local clinics, but also resumed seeing patients in their private practices. So back to these intimate encounters. Raul Harmelin recalled that in Borisław, my father immediately started work as a doctor, and because of that, we could somehow manage, because at that time, money was almost worthless. But patients were bringing us butter and chicken and whatever, and we could, in comparison, we had better conditions because we had something to eat. In Sokal, David Kindler, the only doctor, was already making a living of sorts. Patients were coming to him from all over, as one survivor recalls. None of them has any cash, but they bring him chicken, flour, and butter in payments for his service. These can be kept or sold on the black market. Dr. Kindler gives the families of all his Jewish patients, survivors, a chicken for Sabbath. Kindler also shared the foodstuffs he received from his patients with the woman who saved his life, with Franciszka Halomajowa and her family. So there is also this interesting reversal of roles of caring for patients, not only as physicians, but also helping them in other ways. A close reading of the personal accounts of the war, of the experience of Jewish physicians and their immediate family points to a number of patterns. Both German officials and Ukrainian policemen had sought the service of especially male physicians and had offered them limited protection in exchange. This was the situation of men because apparently in light of venereal diseases or unwanted pregnancies, male physicians seemed more acceptable fit. The non-Jewish local patients who offered or were willing to consider offering shelter drew a line regarding the degree of risk they were ready to take. And we see it with Milch's story. People continue offering him food, but are afraid to hide him, or people are willing to hide him, but are afraid to take in his very young son. Survivors' accounts suggest that relationships with their patients provided Jewish doctors with a support network, a human map of those that either offered assistance or could be asked for help with a reasonable expectation of a positive response. Although based on services rendered before the war, these relationships did not submerge completely under the German occupation. Rather, Jewish physicians were able to remain central figures in many local communities, providing medical assistance for local families. While based on medical expertise, these networks were also personal, calling on their patients or being offered help by former patients implied a degree of qui pro quo. But they gave Jewish physicians limited but crucial agency in their struggle for survival. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I see that we have already one question in the Q&A. So I'll start with that, but please put your questions in the Q&A for Professor Aleksiun, and we'll go through the list. So I want to start with the first question that's there from Morgan Morales. I see what appear to be specialities listed in the directory slide. I guess it's about a slide that came earlier. For example, wound for internist and gyn for gynecologist. Do you have a sense for the demographics of what specialties were more common for Jewish doctors?
Oh, this is such a great question. Thank you very much. So yes, they are internal. They're very, very commonly practicing internal medicine, family medicine, gynecology, and obstetrics. And this is a broader question, of course. In small towns like those that I showed you the images of, there wouldn't be really enough of a market for neurology, for example. But if you go to large urban centers, neurology is very much, quote unquote, a Jewish field. So in general, and there has been a lot of research has been done on Vienna in this regard, right? We know about psychoanalysis, but the new fields of medicine are very much drawing interest of Jewish students for reasons of openness, a relative openness to take this direction on. In those smaller towns, these were the fields of medicine that were most required. And another aspect would be, of course, dentistry.
Thank you very much. Moving on to the next question from Michael Millenson. Is there an estimate on how many Jewish doctors, percentage-wise, survived in Galicia or Poland?
I hope I will give this answer in the book that I hope to finish during this academic year. I'm still hesitant. I mean, I have Excel and I'm counting, but a lot of the reports on the numbers of survivors returning in the first weeks and months, they don't always specify who they are. So they just say, no, there were only so many of us at the end of the war. So I'm a little hesitant to put it into a number. But the fact that this is a profession that emerges as visible among survivors is very clear. Not only because there is a need for them, and really there are accounts in which Ukrainian or Polish inhabitants of those small towns, while there is a whole topic of unwelcoming of survivors, right? People say, you know, we thought that Hitler finished you all off, and here you are coming back. There is a lack of enthusiasm, to put it very mildly, that survivors experience in Eastern Galicia and elsewhere. But physicians, this is good news. And some Christian patients say, no, so good you're back. We didn't have a doctor for a year. Sort of between the liquidation of the last camp and the arrival of the Red Army. So I don't have the statistics yet. Maybe I will have something, but I need to now just leave you with that sense that this is a profession that is very visible.
Thank you. Next question is about medical supplies. How can you comment on how Jewish physicians were able to obtain medical supplies, especially for treating Jewish patients? Presumably this was difficult and risky.
Again, a great question. And here, I must say that we have what we have in the EGO documents, in the accounts. Meaning people note the difficulty. This is the question of being able to go to the non-Jewish side and get the medications, get the supplies. The one specific, and this doesn't have to do with saving lives, of course, but the one access to supply that is very explicitly discussed is the fact that Jewish physicians, or pharmacists for that matter, have access to poison, and that becomes an extremely attractive commodity to have as people lose hope and simply want to decide for themselves to be able to take their own lives. And there's a great deal of jealousy about physicians who can commit suicide together with their immediate families, or who can give poison to their aged parents. But people don't go into details with that. And I was also looking at wartime memoirs of non-Jewish physicians, hoping that I will find some traces. But I simply have to work with what I have. But again, a great question.
Thank you. I'm going to take the next two questions together from Barbara Marcello and Lisa Ring, because the first question asks, did many of the physicians remain or go back to Poland after the war? And the second questions are asked, I guess the flip side of that, was there a shortage of physicians as a result, I guess, of the high percentage of Jewish physicians after the war? Was there a kind of medical brain drain in post-war Poland?
Yeah, yes and yes, meaning Eisner, for example, whose memoir about Borszczów I referred to, goes back. He comes out of hiding and then is repatriated. That's the official name of the population movement from the territory that becomes part of the Soviet Union to the new borders of post-war Poland. And he, like many survivors from the so-called borderlands, go to these new territories for a number of reasons. They tend to be safer for Jews. They offer places of work. The authorities are interested and invested in survivors settling there for political reasons. And he is essential in developing medical school in Stettin, the former German city. But he's unusual in that he remains in Poland. He's also unusual in that he doesn't seem to have changed his name at any point. While Ludwig Landau, for example, goes to Lower Silesia, but until he leaves for Israel in 56, he works under Polish non-Jewish name. And so this is something to be said again. This could be another lecture altogether. The ways in which survivors make home in post-war Poland, but there are various strategies that are required for that to happen, and changing names is one of them. Now there is definitely a huge lack of medical professionals, and it is related to the Holocaust. what is done is that medical schools are opened, new medical schools are opened, and there is a rapid push for training. So at some point, I guess the crisis becomes less acute, but there is definitely a sense of a dramatic deficiency.
Thank you. We have, I think, 4 questions right now on the chat. I know that it is 1 a.m. for you, Professor Aleksiun. So
the adrenaline is high. I'm happy.
So we're going to go through the 4 questions. I just want to say to the attendees, if you have questions, please post them now, because we also, even with the adrenaline, want to be mindful of the time difference in Europe. So next question from Eli Nierenberg. From 1933 to 1939, many Jews were able to flee Germany. Does it also seem that doctors took any opportunity to flee, or were they more likely to stay due to the obligations to their local communities?
Interesting. I must say, I don't recall off the top of my head physicians seeking ways to emigrate in the last couple of years before the war. There are many accounts of especially young people who are desperately seeking a way out, with some more or less vague sense that good things are not going to happen, that, you know, that there is some sense of doom and danger. I remember interviewing many years ago in Israel a Bundist who kind of converted himself to Zionism so that he could get on the certificate as a chalutz, as a pioneer, and he talked about it very openly. And afterwards, he didn't go back to Bundism. He stayed a Zionist on the kibbutz. But I think that with physicians, what I didn't have time to talk about, these are members of local elites, right? They are middle class, and for the conditions of these towns, they're upper middle class. They belong to local elite, not only Jewish, but also Christian. So it's very difficult to pick up a life of that kind and leave. For very recent graduates of medical school, this might be different, because also professional opportunities are very, very limited. And it's not an accident that many of these people that I mentioned studied medicine abroad, not in Poland, because in the 30s, the numerus clausus is already quite strict, and just a handful of Jews are accepted to medical schools, with anticipation that it will become from numerus clausus, from a quota of a percentage, to basically closing the doors of medical schools to Jews altogether. So it's more an issue maybe of young sons and daughters of physicians, but not physicians themselves.
Thank you. The next 2 questions relate to public health, so I'm going to take them together. You focus on physicians treating individual patients. However, public health would have the potential to save many more lives. And Michael Rockman adds, continuation of the question about public health, can you comment on the role that physicians and other health professionals played in public health measures, especially in the ghettos? In the Warsaw Ghetto, there is a report that public health measures saved lives from a typhus epidemic.
Yeah, I made a gentle reference to Miriam Offer's book because it's really one of the best studies there is of public health efforts. And she focuses on Warsaw and shows this extremely, and there's actually another important book coming out in Hebrew for now, but hopefully will be translated, on Israel Milarikowski, who was the head of the health department in Warsaw Ghetto in Judenrat. So these are elaborate healthcare systems concerned with exactly with these measures to stop or prevent, well, they couldn't prevent, but to make the spread of epidemic diseases less dramatic in the ghettos. But while I was talking about those individual relationships with patients, because they then become the vehicle for rescue for many physicians, they are all engaged in public health measures before. And I think that this is something that characterizes the profession regardless of the size of the community they serve. What simply differs it from say Warsaw, Kraków, or Łódź is the size and the resources that they have at their disposal, right? Those outpatient clinics have 5 beds, 10 beds. These are very small outfits, and still they need to serve communities that with refugees swell from 3,000 to 10,000, from 5,000 to 10,000. Again, the needs are always bigger, the abilities, but the ambitions, I think, are very similar, and the understanding of the need to serve the community and also to serve the Christian patients. I don't think it's connected only with that sense that these are contacts that are going to be a life-saving potentially. They continue to treat people they had treated before the war.
The next 2 questions actually relate to the motivations of people who helped. So Yemin Goldbaum asks, I was wondering if any of the accounts talk about having received help on the account of their former friendships with the Christian neighbors or friends, and not the service, I guess the medical service that they provided. And following up on that question, there's a second one asking, do you think the motivation of the Christian patients to help the Jewish physicians was humanitarian or more for their own health?
Well, first of all, it's impossible to really pass judgment. And it's impossible to pass judgment even when people spell these out, because they spell these out in very particular context. For example, in a context of files of the righteous among the nations, when there are certain formulas that are used, about humanitarian motivation and such. But it seems to me that there are indeed that there's indeed a sense of gratitude, and I found some of these. I decided to speak only about Eastern Galicia, but I found these, of course, in other places as well, where people, for example, say, this doctor saved my child when my son was sick, so I offered to shelter the physician's child on the Aryan side. So there is a sense of embeddedness, really, and in those relationships with peasants. I mean, these are very poor areas for the most part, and so I think that just having a relationship between a physician in Borisław and a peasant somewhere in the vicinity implies that this was probably pro bono. Because there's no way that that person could actually pay. And this Ivan Baran, for example, that I mentioned, who had hit his physician during the pogrom, he had the Jewish physician Ludwig Landau treated his wife when she had difficult birth and saved her life. So again, these are intimate and unspoken relationships of gratitude. And now with the 1 a.m., I forgot the first question, Flora, if you can remind me.
It was along the same lines about the motivation. So you answered, okay. You answered both. There's one final question before we're going to end for tonight. About the ability of Jews to go to medical school before the war. Was it fairly easy for Jews to be admitted to medical school in Poland? It's a question by Jim Goldsmith.
This I can actually talk about the rest of the night. So this is a very dangerous question. Well, let me say this. At the beginning of the period, in the early 20s, Jews are 30–40% of medical students in the region, in Poland, in Romania, in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary. Very briefly, this ends as Hungary puts a quota system first. And by the end of the period, just before the outbreak of the war, it's a small fraction of that number, meaning there is a push for creating obstacles for Jewish students because medicine is perceived as one of the most important venues for upward mobility. And also there's a whole question of, the body of the nation in all these nation states, and should really Christian patients be treated by Jewish physicians. There's fascinating literature, and I'm going to write about it a little bit in the book on the cadaver affair in the context of training Jewish physicians, so to speak, over the dead bodies of Christians, of Christian medical bodies in lessons of anatomy. But there's a great deal of discussion in the press about how Jewish physicians and non-Jewish patients are not in sync. They don't understand one another. They don't understand pain and suffering the same way. There is no good communication. So for a Christian, it's actually not safe to be treated by a Jewish physician. So this is a much bigger story. But precisely because of that question, these intimate, close relationships that I was hoping to share with you are such an important and interesting phenomena.
Thank you very much. Well, this was the last question. Thank you very much for your presentation. This was a difficult topic, but I think we learned a lot about physicians' health, human relations, helping and motivations. The Q&A was excellent. So thank you to everyone for attending. And thank you again, Professor Aleksiun, for your presentation.
Thank you very much. And thank you for great questions, really.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us tonight. I think this really was a fantastic lecture and a very interesting discussion. I want to thank Professor Kassa and Professor Reinhardt for being our moderator and introducer and kind of technological standby for any emergencies that may arise, which we all know do all the time. I've already received a number of emails as you were speaking, Natalia, thanking you for a wonderful lecture and for a great opportunity to learn about your work. And I'm sure there will be more. But I think there's also some messages in the chat. So I think this was a great event, which we have recorded. I assume it's okay to publicize it, Natalia. So we will post it on our website somewhere, and we'll reach out to everybody who registered for the talk with the link, so you can watch it again or refer to your friends and share the good
and
knowledge.
If you have knowledge of any memoirs or memoirs in your in some secret drawer in the family, of course I would love to know.
Okay, well, we'll pass that on. You might be flooded with emails. We'll see.
Good night.
So thanks everyone again, and have a good night wherever you are.
Good night.
Night.